Professor Trevor Tombe, you're a professor of economics with the University of Calgary. You've written and commented about this proposal to leave the Alberta pension plan. Tell me about some of the issues you have with the report that was presented to Albertans.
Sure. So, what we saw when Alberta launched its engagement panel on whether Alberta should separate from the Canada Pension Plan, I also came out with my own academic paper on this, recently published in a Canadian public policy journal, that takes a very different perspective from what LifeWorks does. Now, it's not that there's anything wrong with the math. I think we both agree on how different assumptions lead to different results. But what they presume in their analysis is that Alberta would be able to take 53% of the Canada Pension Plan assets when it leaves. And I think that's a misreading of the language of the law that would govern the split of the CPP Act. A close reading of it, does reveal that it's imprecise, unfortunately, in lots of ways. But a more careful reading suggests that about 20 to 25% of the CPP assets would be potentially provided to a withdrawing Alberta. So, and that's not nothing. Right? That's a disproportionate share relative to our share of overall contributions, for example, to the plan. But 53% is just not going to happen. And so the engagement is based on presumed benefits of a separate plan that are just not in the cards. And so it's kind of really tilting the scales in favor of withdrawing from the CPP, when I think the reality is going to be very different if we go down that road.
The other factor, too, you've mentioned is Alberta's age demographic. Alberta is a very young population, which affects things. Can you explain that a bit for the folks at home?
Sure. So any pension plan is more easy to sustain if it has many young contributors. Yeah, that makes sense. You contribute when you're working and you don't collect anything until later. And the further out into the future you can push those collections, the easier it is to sustain and the less you have to contribute in the first place. So Alberta, being a young province, does give it a pension advantage relative to others. No question about that. So even my own estimates suggest that the contribution rate of a separate Alberta plan would be about 1.3 percentage points lower than the Canada Pension Plan. That's a lower reduction than the 4 points that the government is putting forward, but still a meaningful reduction in contributions. And that's really driven by the favorable demographics that exists in the province. But it's not just benefits, right? There are costs to consider as well, in particular, risks. Interprovincial migration flows, for example, who moves in and who moves out of Alberta would matter a lot for the future of the plan. And most of the advantage that we have in Alberta is due to favorable inflows of workers from elsewhere. And if that ceases, then most of that advantage will disappear. And that's a risk that the Canada Pension Plan doesn't face. Like, it doesn't matter whether you live in BC, Saskatchewan, or Ontario from their perspective. So a separate plan has larger and new risks that we'd have to confront. So there's a balance between benefits and costs here that we need to consider.
And when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned one of the other big issues you have is the way that Albertans are being consulted about this right now. Would you call it a lack of consultation or a lack of meaningful consultation on the details of this plan?
Yeah, I guess I'm of the view in general, not just pension plans, but all policy choices, that governments should think about what the preferences of individuals are who live in this case, in Alberta, consulting them to learn what those preferences are, not engage in large scale marketing campaigns to try and shift what is a wildly unpopular policy position at the moment into something that would just get over the 50% plus one mark if we were to have a referendum. So at the moment, it's pretty clear that Alberta is not actually having a consultation or engagement on an Alberta pension plan. What there is an organized marketing campaign to try and convince Albertans that it's a good idea. Whereas I come down on, there are benefits and there are costs, and these should be evaluated openly and transparently, and reasonable people can weigh those costs and benefits differently. It's not an unreasonable position to support a separate Alberta plan, and it's not an unreasonable position to support staying in the Canada Pension Plan. But the government is not even allowing that conversation to occur.
And the last thing I wanted to just ask you is it's hard not to see this as a bit of a political back and forth between Alberta and Ottawa, but you've mentioned this has big, big consequences if Alberta chooses to leave.
Yeah, pension plans are fairly unique in that it's a policy that has very long lasting consequences, not just for Albertans today, but even future Albertans that are not yet born. I mean, consider someone who's graduating high school, just entering the workforce right now. They'll be collecting a pension out of either an Alberta or the Canada pension plan in the 2070s or 2080s. And many of them, nearly 1 in 10 of these high school graduates, will live into the 22nd century and collect their pension. And so we need to think about how our actions today affect those future Albertans, not to mention the ones that are still in elementary school or not yet born. And so this is unlike other policies. This is also one that's not easy to reverse. It is under the current structure of the CPP, withdrawing is irreversible. And so it is a very serious decision that we should be engaging with seriously.
Well, Professor Tombe, I appreciate you making the time for me today. I know it's such a complicated issue, and thanks for trying to break it down for folks watching at home. And take
My
care.
pleasure anytime.